Welcome to this special edition of the Worldwide Hydro Headlines. I'm Gregory B. Poindexter, Associate Editor for Hydro Review and HRW, Hydro Review Worldwide. The Hydro Group at Penwell Publishing strives to provide you, the hydro industry professional, with a wealth of wide-ranging and useful information. In addition to hydroworld.com, each Thursday at hubs.biz, you have the opportunity to watch a segment that focuses on hydropower on Inside the Industry during Power Today. Power Today host and my colleague, Cassie Haley, will explain. Cassie?
Hi, Greg. It's great being here with you for Hydro Headlines. As many of you know, Elizabeth Ingram is a veteran of the hydropower industry and managing editor of Hydro Review and HRW Hydro Review Worldwide. For today's special broadcast, watch as Elizabeth discusses hydropower-related financing during a recent segment of Inside the Industry. Thank you for joining Inside the Industry. Let's welcome Elizabeth Ingram.
Thank you.
Last time you joined us, Elizabeth, you told us all about small hydro, but I am always amazed at the enormity of the giant hydropower projects. How much does something like that cost?
Yeah, I think that the subject of financing hydropower is really fascinating, and there is a ton of money behind that type of development work, rehabilitation work. So a couple years ago in Hydro Review magazine, we decided to try and sort of capture the size of the market for hydropower. That was really just in the U.S., but we found that of the 10 largest hydro financing deals in the U.S. that year, that they were more than $18.7 billion. And those were new development, acquisitions, all kinds of different financing deals. But it was really surprising how much money was being spent on hydropower. And that was just in the U.S. So we've done some looking kind of internationally to see how the numbers kind of match up. And the International Hydropower Association, for example, they reported that in 2015 there were 33 gigawatts of new hydropower capacity built worldwide. So if you look at a per kilowatt basis of cost of developing those facilities, that activity alone was about $75.9 billion of investment. And that's just in new development, not rehab, not upgrades, not acquisitions, just new development.
It's incredible. I mean, where does that money come from?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of different sources for financing hydro, and that's also the biggest challenge for the hydropower industry. Where do we find that money? How do we access it? And so obviously one of the bigger options is the multilateral funding banks.
Okay.
And so on hydroworld.com recently we reported on some activity in that sector. The multilateral banks are really vital for hydropower development, primarily in the developing world. So a couple of recent deals that we reported on in terms of financing were the Asian Development Bank. They actually came out saying they were not going to commit funding to the Diamar Basha project in Pakistan right now. They're not saying they won't commit financing later. But in the same stroke, they were saying that they were going to provide $100 million to develop other hydro plants in the country. So there's one example of a multilateral bank funding hydro. And another one is the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. They just committed to providing $55 million to support renewable energy in Turkey, including hydropower. Okay. Just a couple of examples of how important those multilateral banks are and the size of the funding that they can offer to hydropower.
They are. Where else could some of that funding come from?
Another place that a lot of hydropower funding comes from is from government support.
Okay.
For example, in Canada. So the government helps fund development of hydro projects in Canada. And recently, the federal government provided an additional $2.9 billion to help build the 825 megawatt Muskrat Falls project in Labrador. Total investment for that project is expected to be $11.4 billion. So the government's, putting their support behind that. And then the government of Zimbabwe recently released $20.3 million to complete a small hydro facility in that country. So those are just a couple of very recent examples of the government funding hydropower development.
What about the private sector?
Oh, the private sector, that's a great question. The private sector is so important to hydro development. There's a lot of focus on getting private financing for hydropower to kind of fill that gap between what the government can offer, what the multilateral banks can offer, and how we can get the money to finalize some of these facilities. So in Scotland, it was a really interesting case study we just published on our website. A small group called the Rumbling Bridge Hydro Community actually did a stock offering to build a small hydro facility, and they got all the money they needed and a little bit more
from the private sector.
From private sector individuals. putting their support behind hydro in that country. And then earlier this year, the International Hydropower Association hosted a webinar on trends in hydropower financing that was really interesting, and it talked about particularly donor-backed finance to mobilize private financing into the hydropower sector and to capitalize on what they're calling public-private partnerships to build more hydro. So many countries, they really need those public-private partnerships, and there's definitely more interest in them and more momentum behind them. So I see that as an area where there can be more funding available for hydropower to get more of these projects built.
Okay. Thanks again for joining us, Elizabeth, and sharing the fascinating world of financing for hydro.
Well, that's it for this week's edition of the Worldwide Hydro Headlines, brought to you by Hydro Consulting and Maintenance Services. Make sure you check us out on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook, and remember, we deliver hydro information at high capacity.